Right, a former cabinet minister has doubled down on his criticism of nurses using food banks after his comments were branded disgusting, heartless and out of touch. Former Levelling Up Secretary Simon Clarke said the average nurse's salary of £35,000 a year is not a salary on which you need to be relying on a food bank. This is such a huge debate, isn't it? Right, now joining me now to debate this is former editor of the Sunday Mirror, Paul Connu. Welcome. And the very gorgeous and wearing a lovely suit, I have to say, Reem Ibrahim, political commentator. Welcome, both of you. Thank you so much for coming in on a Friday night. Really appreciate it. We do have wine coming, by the way. Right. Now, what do we think about this? Paul, I'm going to come to you first because you have actually got annoyed about Conservative politicians commentating on who and who shouldn't be using food banks. Yes. So do you think they should just shut up and let nurses get on with using food banks?
I think this has been, for the government, has been a week which Armando Iannucci wouldn't have dared to a Thick-a-Bit episode like this week, culminating with tonight's news that Rishi Sunak has had his second fixed penalty fine. And Boris Johnson bouncing around Davos while the Prime Minister is trying to stay at home. Police corruption and rape, you know, it's unbelievable. But I think among this week, it was a classic own goal by a former cabinet minister, a man on, well, he's now on £84,000 a year as an MP. He was a lot more when he was for a brief time, the Levelling Up minister, and before that, the first secretary to the Treasury. I mean, it is arrogant. Because apart from the salary, MPs have generous expenses, some would argue too generous, and I just think it was insulting to the nurses. And his figures were wrong as well. Yes, the average pay, but that takes into top-line nurses, you know, senior nurses have been around for 20 years, might get up to 47,000. But what about the young nurses whose average pay is between 20 and 25,000?
OK, right, Reem, I'm going to come to you on this one now. So the current average salary in the UK is £22,756, which is less. I take the point that some are on more, some are on less. Less than the average earnings of a nurse or a teacher who's on 32,000. So if the average UK income is £27,756, why are we all using food banks? Why are there huge queues at food banks? Why is it just the nurses and the teachers and those in the public sector who are also going out on strike?
Look, I first of all want to say I think that, you know, we are sort of in an incredibly privileged position to sort of be talking about the fact that these individuals obviously felt the need that they had to go to food banks. But look, I think that the majority of British people are able to budget and able to understand how to sort of allocate that money to their food. And, you know, food and heating and energy bills, you know, those prices are increasing as a result of government policy, which has directly caused inflation. But again, I think that the majority of people can survive on that amount of money. I graduate this year and my graduate job probably won't be anything more than £25,000 a year. And I live in London. So, you know, I will have to learn to budget, or maybe I'll end up on a food bank in the next few months.
Do you live alone or do you share it?
So I live with my family, and I decided to not move out at all during university. And actually I chose a university close to home just so that I wouldn't be able to afford rent in London. But again, I think that the majority of people are able to sort of budget that. I don't understand why nurses that are on upwards of £35,000 a year are having to go to food banks. But I think that, look, when people feel that they need to get there, they do. I think that what we need to sort of change is this culture around spending. I think during COVID, we sort of spent a huge amount of money because we were able to, because we were at home. We need to learn to budget more and actually prioritise where we spend our money.
But hospitals aren't setting up food banks sometimes in the hospital for fun. There is a need for this. And the costs often of doing a nursing job, especially if you're a young nurse, is prohibitive by the time you've paid your travel costs, your fuel, even having to, if you've got a car, you have to pay to actually, many hospitals pay to park it.
Which is ridiculous, I agree. But, Paul, sorry, excuse me. Don't you think that Reem has a point that, and several of the politicians that you've criticised have made the point that maybe with a bit of help to budget and a bit of common sense about how you spend your money, there would be less reliance on food banks for some of these.
It's very patronising for MPs on their salaries and perks. I mean, I've seen MPs who actually charge their poppies on their expenses. This is, if anybody's not qualified to really pontificate and lecture nurses about budgeting, it's...
Does it matter how much they earn? Isn't it really just about the actual sort of the reality of the situation? I mean, somebody could sort of be earning below £20,000 a year and actually say the exact same point. I don't think where it comes from really matters, but the facts matter. And the fact of the matter is the majority of people aren't earning as much as nurses, and the majority of people are not on food banks.
Well, that's true. Although we don't know, because there hasn't been, as far as I can see, any proper study of private sector workers who may be at food banks. We don't really know that. So I think it's targeting nurses, as certain MPs did, was a crass PR own goal. I mean, I know one senior Tory MP friend of mine who actually buried his head in his hands and said, another own goal, in fact. And I'm glad to see Michael Gove rather slapped down, in fact, the MPs who came out and attacked them, try to dictate how nurses should budget.
Yeah, I've got to say I do agree, and I think that we shouldn't be attacking nurses, but what we should be attacking is actually the failure of our education system. The fact that we haven't been taught financial literacy, the fact that we have... I mean, I graduate this year. I've never been taught how to budget my own money. My first job when I was 16, I was earning £5.50 an hour, and I was somehow able to get by, during school. And granted, I was living at home, but that covered my travel. But you just learn to budget yourself. I think this is a failure of the education system. The majority of people my age going into the workforce do not know how to budget, and we haven't been taught how to.
I think there's some truth in that, but I also think that the current crisis on the cost of living is very different, and I think for well-paid, I think politicians, are not overpaid, but they are much better paid than the average nurse. And to pontificate is simply and criticise nurses and tell them how they should budget better is actually arrogant and insulting.
Going back to Reem's point, does that mean you can only have an opinion on this and criticise if you are on the same income as...
Well, no, I'm a believer in free speech, but if you're so foolish as to come out with that sort of attack, expect the backlash.
So, I mean, the thing is, a lot of the, not necessarily when we talk about that, but a lot of politicians you've had a go at. I mean, there's three of them all together, isn't there?
Well, Simon Clarke is the main.
Lee Anderson, who we've had on here, and Brendan Clark-Smith. You've called them arrogant and counterproductive to talk about public sectors using food bank workers. Now, they've also offered advice on budgeting and how to prepare meals cheaply. Lee, in particular, has done so. Now, the one thing I would like to...
Well, hang on a minute. Lee's talking about sort of your back garden being your sort of allotment. In fact, a lot of the people involved in nursing haven't got a back garden.
That was how he was...
Yes.
No, but to Reem's point about being taught budgeting, I mean, Rishi Sunak goes on about teachers all maths until we're 60 or whenever he wants to do it. But, teachers' basic budgeting, I mean, sort of like quadratic equations are pointless compared to running a family budget and feeding yourself.
Exactly. We're not taught about tax. We're not taught about how to actually budget our money. I think when it comes down to really simple things like getting, there are various different schemes that you can get onto that mean that you get sort of cheaper travel. Even if you're a student, you get sort of discounted travel on most TfL buses. So I think that the fact that these things aren't taught to us...
What about these, just for example, the divorced nurse who is a mother of two, whose childcare costs wipe out a large chunk of her salary anyway?
Well, the primary reason we have
so
such
an MP
high...
telling her she doesn't know how to budget is patronising and insulting.
Yes, but the reason why we have such high childcare costs is because of the extortionate regulations that the government have put forward. I mean, the fact that we have such high child-staff ratios essentially mean that the government are forcibly increasing prices. So I think we should put the blame to the government.
It's also another, one of my pet themes, it's also another legacy of Brexit, along with the chronic shortage of care workers and NHS workers. The B word, which everyone's running...
The B word Freesat. We actually have a B word collection box here. Any time it's a swear box, every time someone uses it, you have to give me a £5.
Right.
The B word.
I'll give it to you afterwards.
Which I would
donate
to food bank or something. The one thing I want to ask you, though, here, Paul, in fact, both of you, Why is it OK for food bloggers like Jack Monroe, very left-wing, and did an amazing job telling people how to budget, what to go and buy, what's cheap in which supermarkets, how to prep a meal on 30p to pluck that from thin air?
Martin
obviously.
Lewis, money-saving expert, why is it OK for them, who obviously earn that much? But,
exactly.
They're able to do that.
Why is it OK for left-wing people to come out with a similar thing, but if it's a right-wing politician that does it, or a Conservative politician, not even that right-wing, why is that an issue?
I totally defend their right to come out and say it, but...
You called them arrogant and counterproductive.
Yes, exactly. But
you don't say that about Martin Lewis or Jack Monroe.
Well, I don't agree there that it's the same. But if anybody's entitled to attack them as well. Free speech allows that. But, as I said before, take the backlash. And I don't think the public, we haven't seen any snap polls on it, but I doubt the public were on the side of the MPs who actually condemned nurses and, for going to food banks or saying they couldn't manage their budgets.
Actually, very interesting to hear what you think out there, so do let us know tonight, please do. Reem, do you think there is an element of this issue, in particular the food bank issue, which is incredibly emotive? It is damaging to the whole food bank business, if I can use that phrase, and the people that are really, really down on their uppers and need to use them. Do you think it has become a political football and the unions, dare I say, are using it to score political points against the government they want to bring down?
Absolutely. I think that, look, unions at the moment specifically are using food banks as a sort of political tool in order to sort of criticise the government. And, you can criticise the government in many ways, but when you're actually using information that isn't factual, that is incredibly emotive, I think it's unfair. And I think that, look, when you've got these unions that are sort of encouraging, sort of saying that nurses need to use these food banks, actually, again, that is taking it away from those people that actually genuinely are homeless or genuinely do need to be able to go to food banks and receive that care.
One quick comment. Sorry, we've got to go. Just one quick comment.
But conversely, you could argue that the Sunak government are adopting a position on the strikes of not even negotiating on pay because the Tory party is currently almost in a civil war, and that is to keep happy the right wing of the party.
In the backseat of a car with that seatbelt on. Unfortunately, we have to go there. Thank you so much.